Hello. Last time we saw how the Dutch Republic, whose rise according to the historian John Lothrop Motley must ever be regarded as one of the leading events of modern times, bucked the absolutist trend of the period. As we saw, Holland experimented with religious pluralism and formed a decentralized republic whose rulers were subject to constitutional restraints. Another nation that bucked the trend of the times and pursued a path towards constitutionalism was England, but she did so only after almost a century of civil war and revolution. The tortuous process began upon the death of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603. Dying without issue, she was succeeded by her nearest relative, King James VI of Scotland, the first of the new Stuart dynasty, who was the son, ironically enough, of Mary, Queen of Scots. When James left his native Scotland, he moved to an England that was divided along religious lines and that had a parliament eager to assert itself after the death of Elizabeth. Religiously, England was divided into three groups. First, there were Anglicans, that is, members of the Church of England, which included, at least in theory, all of James's subjects. Then there were Puritans, Calvinist Protestants, who thought the Church of England needed to go further in ridding itself of its Roman Catholic trappings. And lastly, there were Catholics, who by necessity led a fairly clandestine existence and were mostly loyal subjects, although there were a few extremists prepared to resort to violence. Now, Elizabeth had managed to reconcile these fractious elements, but religion will remain a source of tension for the remainder of the 17th century. Parliament was yet another source of tension. Indeed, tension between it and the Crown would determine the course of English history until the Glorious Revolution of 1688. England's Parliament was and remains a bicameral legislature. That is, it is a representative assembly with two chambers or houses. A lower chamber, whose members are elected, called the House of Commons, and an upper chamber, whose members are there by right of birth, called the House of Lords. Because Parliament possessed the famed power of the purse, namely the right to approve new taxes, kings could not ignore it if they wished to remain solvent. Of the two, it was the Commons where opposition to unrestrained royal authority was the strongest. And it was here that the gentry, large, non-noble landowners, many of them Puritans, sat. Although Elizabeth clashed with Parliament on occasion, she always managed to maintain, through her willingness to compromise, a functioning relationship between it and the Crown. Her successor, James, however, was cut from very different cloth than Elizabeth. His relationship with Parliament quickly became querulous. On becoming King James I of England in 1603, this son of the woman executed by his predecessor on the throne remained James VI of Scotland, thereby uniting his two kingdoms in what is called a union of crowns. When told that he would succeed Elizabeth, he must have felt he'd won the monarchical lottery, for England was far richer than his native Scotland. In keeping with other monarchs of the time, James believed in the divine right of kings. In fact, he had written a treatise, The True Law of Free Monarchies, in which he claimed that kings are God's representatives on earth and linked their divinely ordained rule to the apostolic succession. James saw himself as a latter-day Solomon, dispensing justice and shaping the culture through his writings, but retaining absolute and unquestioned authority over his subjects. Something of a pedant, James had an opinion about everything and was once famously described as the wisest fool in Christendom by Henry IV of France, his son-in-law, some suggest. He even wrote a pamphlet attacking the evils of tobacco, although his Scottish origins and interest in witchcraft inspired Shakespeare to write one of his greatest plays, the tragedy of Macbeth. As regards his views on religion, James favoured the Church of England, believing its hierarchical episcopal structure helped provide the foundations upon which an absolutist monarchy could be built. One of his favourite sayings, in fact, was "No bishops, no king." This and his embrace of other aspects of Anglicanism brought him into conflict with Puritans who opposed bishops and thought the Church of England far too Catholic. Now, regarding Catholics, any threat the radicals among them might have posed James was soon eliminated by the exposure of the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Now, this involved a conspiracy among a small group of committed Catholic radicals led by Robert Catesby and Guy Fawkes to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament, in which James himself would be present. The conspirators intended this act of terrorism to be the prelude to a rebellion that would return England to Roman Catholicism. However, the conspirators were betrayed by an anonymous letter, their plot was foiled, they were arrested, tortured, tried and found guilty, and then executed with great savagery. On a much more positive note, James's one great contribution to religion was his sponsorship of the English translation of the Old and New Testaments, known ever since as the King James Bible. Published in 1611, its rendering of Scripture into the language of Shakespeare and Francis Bacon has had an incalculable effect on the development of modern English. This priceless literary jewel of English civilization can be considered James I's greatest achievement, in my opinion. Still, many Englishmen found him less than inspiring. As a Scot, he was considered a foreigner. Physically unprepossessing, his legs were spindly, his tongue too big for his mouth, and, according to historian David Price, a lifetime of gluttony and immoderate drinking had much reshaped his head and body. He might also have been homosexual in his practice of promoting handsome male favourites to positions for which they were not qualified and lavishing expensive gifts on them caused many a scandalised eyebrow to raise. Nevertheless, despite his shortcomings, he was widely mourned upon his death in 1625, having brought peace to England and, surprisingly, given his continuing need for money, kept taxes relatively low. Now, all this would change during the reign of his son, Charles I. Now, Charles managed to antagonize his subjects from the start of his reign. While more refined and certainly more sober than his father, he alienated many by his arrogant and headstrong personality. Like his father, he believed in the divine right of kings, but unlike his father, he hated compromise. Furthermore, he alienated Puritans by favouring Arminianism, which, at least in England, favoured reconciliation with Rome and ornate church services. He alienated many more by marrying a French Catholic, Henrietta Marie, daughter of Henry IV. His absolutist tendencies and need for money led him to clash with Parliament, which enjoyed, of course, the power of the purse. A crisis arose in 1628 when Charles was forced by Parliament to sign the Petition of Right in return for money to pay an English army that he committed to the defence of the French city of La Rochelle, a Huguenot stronghold being besieged by Catholic forces at the time. Now, the Petition of Right demanded no taxes without the consent of Parliament, no imprisonment without due process, no quartering of soldiers, and no imposition of martial law. Charles was so incensed at having to sign this document that he chose to rule without Parliament during the so-called 11-year tyranny. Well served by his very able First Minister, the Earl of Strafford, Charles resorted to illegal means to raise revenues, but was forced to recall Parliament in 1639 when his Scottish subjects rose in revolt, angered by his attempt to impose the Anglican Book of Common Prayer on Presbyterian Scotland. Parliament granted Charles the funds needed to suppress the rebellion, but only after forcing him to agree not to dissolve Parliament without its consent and to convene it at least every 3 years. Feeling vindictive, Parliament also forced him to agree to the arrest and trial for treason of the Earl of Strafford, who had proved so instrumental to the success of the 11-year tyranny. Another victim of parliamentary spite was the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, detested by many Puritans for his supposedly popish tendencies and embrace of Arminianism, who was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Charles had no choice but to agree to Parliament's demands. Had he not done so, he would have not received the funds needed to pacify his rebellious Scottish subjects, which he was able to do, but only after resorting to bribing some of them. Even so, he only agreed to sign Strafford's death warrant after Strafford himself, fearing for the future of the monarchy and hoping his execution would help reconcile the English people to their king, begged him to do so. Having allowed the execution to proceed, Charles commented, "My Lord Strafford's condition is happier than mine." Now, just how true that was, we shall see in the lecture that follows. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.